Welcome to the Iron Prescription podcast with your hosts, Drs. Lynette and Stuart. We're both GPs and we're both personal trainers, though we do both jobs in very different ways. We chat about the best things you can do for your health and fitness, and along the way, help you to avoid wasting time on the things that really aren't. Thanks for listening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Here we are again.
Indeed we are.
With levelled up, better quality audio to match the big boys like Joe Rogan.
Check us out with our cans on.
It's worth mentioning the trigger for this was there was a bit of audio that dropped out in the last episode when we were talking about strong men. And when I was editing it back, I realised we'd talked about Eddie Hall, but that bit of audio was just missing. And I thought, right, okay, we can't have this because that whole section now is not clear. So money has been spent on, on fancy headphones. And here we are.
We are investing in our audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's fun. You have to.
Yeah.
So we agreed we were going to talk about health anxiety, which is a massive topic. And rather than try and do it all justice, because there are entire podcast series dedicated to health anxiety, as I realised when I was wondering what I could listen to on a walk to stimulate my thoughts, we probably should narrow it down a bit to, I guess, our own experience of it and probably how it relates to fitness, I would say,
absolutely.
and how the two can be of assistance to one another.
Yeah,
maybe.
Absolutely. Yes,
okay.
Yes. I think it's a really good idea.
So do you want to start with perhaps a definition for anybody that isn't familiar with what we're likely to be referring to with regards to health anxiety?
Okay, so health anxiety is a condition where you have intrusive thoughts about your own health. It's not like a worry where we all have, worries or concerns about, are we doing the right thing? Are we eating the right thing? Are we doing bad things to ourselves? But it's an intrusive thought that's repeating and repetitive, not necessarily about the same thing, but it all focuses around the fact that actually there could be, or there is, something wrong with us. And that something is likely to be catastrophized into being a terminal event.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good summary. And we see a surprising number. Well, maybe it's not surprising, but this is a much more common problem, I would say, than probably most people realise. And I'd like to just segue slightly to say that we need to remember that some level of anxiety is entirely normal and there for the purpose of keeping us alive.
Absolutely. And that's why I sort of categorise that worry or concern that's normal to have that. But when it becomes intrusive and outside of your control, and also very interestingly is not reassured by normal methods, then we classify that as being anxiety that's strayed into the area of mental health.
Yeah. And I think there's fairly reliable data now to suggest that health anxiety is rising in terms of its prevalence. And I guess it doesn't take a genius to work out how many things there are in abundance around us that can feed this. So if you were somebody, say, 40 years ago, that was further along that continuum. And I like to think of anxiety as being on a continuum that we're all on to some extent, but you wouldn't have had quite so much access to information 30, 40 years ago to be able to feed it, indulge it, and for it to get worse. Yeah. That's very different now.
Absolutely. I think that unfortunately, the way that has happened is that the feed has become greater and greater as we've moved forward, not less and less. And I think it really started with the sort of Dear Aunt columns in the newspapers where people could ask questions, or Dear Doctor, or things like that. Then it spread into doctors being on TV. And, I blame the medical profession for a lot of health anxiety, because when you're dealing with somebody on an individual one-to-one basis, it's very easy for me to know what's going on with you. But when I'm dealing with an audience, I have to be generic in my answers. And I also have to in a way, cover my back. So I have to use the words, well, this could, of course, be something more sinister and serious like cancer. And when I'm talking to a population of several tens of thousands of people in the audience that I can't see, that feeds that. And then moving forward, we've now got ambulances. Every time you see an ambulance, what's on the side of an ambulance? There's a man with a belt round his chest. If you've got chest pain, you could be dying. You are dying. See somebody now. Or there is the FAST, which is about stroke awareness, of course, all the sepsis awareness. And all of these are incredibly important messages. But they are messages, not dictation. And people with anxiety take it to be dictation. So as soon as they get a chest pain, they don't think, oh, I've pulled a muscle in my chest. What they think is of that ambulance and this is a heart attack. And they don't put it into any other sort of methodology of working out what could be wrong. They catastrophize and they go straight to the most serious condition.
And yeah, you're right. We haven't helped ourselves as a profession.
No.
And again, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but fear has a lot to account for a lot of where resources go across the NHS as we become more and more specialised, and generalists have less and less of a role, but that's a separate conversation for another day. But yes, behind it is this fear of missing things. And I think even in terms of chronic disease, for example, I was reminded there of one of the older partners that was at retirement age when I started in general practice, so 20 years ago, and he was reflecting how so much was gearing towards looking for things, looking to pick up blood pressure earlier, pick up general cardiovascular disease signs much earlier on. And it used to be just much more reactive. And so he'd seen that big shift. And you could argue that's good. We are sicker. Generally, we do have more chronic disease, and we need to be active in looking for that to try and reduce the complication rate. But the offshoot of that is we are making a lot of otherwise healthy people into patients as a consequence of that. And there are downstream consequences.
Absolutely.
But the biggest thing, coming back specifically to health anxiety, that I've seen firsthand and still continue to see is the person who gets the first symptom and Googles it.
Yeah.
And for anybody, I guess we all are tempted to do that to some extent. The difficulty is, and I still stand by this, is Googling symptoms is rarely helpful. You can Google a condition once you have a diagnosis, and that can be a really useful exercise. But any search engine, others are available, is not going to be able to apply any degree of nuance. You start to see the search history or what it predicts. It's already trying to predict what you're going to look for. And the fact that no matter how sophisticated things have become, computers are still quite bad at this is the catastrophic failure of the big AI experiment that was Babylon, who I worked for a period of time, where, for people that don't know, Babylon was an all singing, all dancing online provider. Their mission was to put healthcare in everybody's pocket through a smartphone, and their symptom checker was going to drastically cut the amount of people that actually needed to speak to a clinician. And it didn't work. And they have since become bankrupt and gone for other reasons as well. But it wasn't able to pick out the nuance that is needed and the skill. And that's exactly the same with Google.
So I don't know whether people understand what we do as doctors, but so I sit and I see a patient, or I might stand and see a patient depending where I am. And I start off with a Google search in my head, and it's absolutely massive. So as you start walking towards me, I'm doing this, I'm bringing it into the sides, and then you start talking and it's coming in. And by the time you start telling me your symptoms, I'm doing this, right? Okay. But I'm using all of that information to give me a diagnosis, and I'm narrowing down my search in my head to come to that, whereas Google stays way out wide. So you put in the symptoms and it just gives you all of this. Now I can give you all of that, but actually what I do is I come in, and as I'm coming in, I'm asking you more and more questions, and I'm getting narrower and narrower, and then I'm doing my examination until I'm left with maybe 2 or 3 diagnoses. And then I need to probably do, if I need to, I might do some tests, or I might say, right, well, it's one of these three things. We don't need to do any tests because the test is going to be the treatment. And actually, if this works, we know where we are. If it doesn't work, we'll do this. Or there is no treatment, it will get better on its own. Whereas Google is never going to do that for you. It's going to stay wide and loud for everything that you're saying.
And you've just made me think of another Google equivalent that's alive and working, and it's 111, which has got a bit better, but it's still got its issues in that it's mostly staffed initially by non-clinical people using flowcharts and algorithms. And lo and behold, you can end up getting sent an ambulance for period pains because there is no ability to reliably filter on some of the nuance that I guess, and you see junior doctors develop this as they go through, that you're sifting all the time. It's in pattern recognition, but it's more than just what the patient's saying. It's also, the tone of voice, what you see in front of you, the history that goes on. And it's very complex. Sadly, we have that system and everybody will have heard the stories of ambulances being sent here, there and everywhere for a toothache.
I think the thing is, an absolute classic example of that, an algorithm-driven answer, is out of 10, how badly would you say the pain is? And if a patient says to me, oh, God, it's so bad, it's got to be a 9. And I'm like, do you really mean a 9? And they're like, well, what's a 9? Well, okay, so 10 would be dying. Oh, no, it's about 2.
Yeah.
But if the system doesn't ask, doesn't say, if the system doesn't look at them and go, you're not in 9 out of 10 pain, and doesn't challenge that and goes 9, then that's the answer that the algorithm will drive to come to its own conclusion. So there is no interaction there. There is no challenge on what the answer is given. It is just straightforward, yes, no, yes, no.
Yeah.
It's a binary algorithm.
Yeah. And again, obviously, the person Googling symptoms, it's very easy for your story to suddenly take on a life of its own, your symptom story, based on what it's telling you. And again, we know historically from data that's been knocking around, I heard this, I can't remember if there was a medical student or a junior doctor, but classically, the patient who comes in with a heart attack, the more times they give the history of that heart attack, the more the story evolves over time to become closer to the classic central crushing chest pain that goes into the jaw, the way we describe it in the textbooks. Whereas actually, that's almost what's happening with Google. Right, I've got this kind of pain. What could it be? Could be this. Oh, God, hang on, I have got pins and needles. Oh, am I sweating? Well, I might be. And suddenly it takes on a life of its own. That's part of the problem. And then where the point at which you can reach the patient on that journey will sometimes back you into a corner. If you're speaking to them from out of hours and you don't know all of their medical history, you are sometimes backed into having to do some investigations that might not have been necessary if you'd perhaps seen them at a different point.
I mean, I really do feel for people with health anxiety. And the reason for that is that I have health anxiety. I'm a healthcare professional with decades of experience, and I've got that Google in my head. I don't need to search Google. And I really do understand how that intrusive thought can be so debilitating and you just can't break it. And it seems like there is no way out of it. But that brings us back to why we're here. And we're talking about fitness. And one of the biggest things that I'd say helps me with my health anxiety, and health anxiety is like all of these things, it's not something that goes away forever. I'm never going to be somebody who's not concerned about my health. I like to think in a normal way now, but it's something that's in the background. That demon is there, and that intrusive thought is there. But what helps me is if I can go out and, big pun, blag a marathon.
That was a medal for anybody listening and not watching it. That was at the camera.
That makes me feel that actually what could be wrong with me? Because I'm able to perform at that level, a huge amount of underlying training. So therefore that reassures me in my own health. And also we know that not only that the sport that I am doing or that we do releases chemicals that are very similar to the medication that we would use to treat health anxiety, which is SSRIs, that's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. or antidepressants as the public generally know them. And we know that they're very good for health anxiety. But we also know that actually sport and exercise is as good, if not better, for those same conditions.
Yeah, I heard, I think it was a psychologist, might be wrong anyway, explaining, and this was about generalized anxiety disorder actually, and why exercise is so beneficial for it, in that we all start the day with a full battery, and if you are very anxious, it's going to consume some of that battery. And if you're not energetic and you're not moving, you've got more available energy to feed the anxiety monster that's going on. And if it hones in on health anxiety, then, where's Google? Where's my phone? Let me kind of indulge in that. And if actually you expend a good dose of that energy battery on something else, it just takes the intensity out of it and makes it easier to manage, and you're more likely to be able to, I wouldn't say resist, because anxiety is a survival instinct and it's not designed to be easily overridden, but it's taking some of the heat out of it, some of the intensity. And I really liked that analogy, because I thought actually any situation where anxiety is a problem, even if it's an acute stress reaction to something that's gone on, and lots of people who have a regular fitness habit will have already probably recognised that, well, okay, I can go for a run, or I can go to the gym or ride my bike, and actually I will feel better at the end of it. And walking can do the same thing. But I think the analogy specifically with health anxiety is even more powerful, because how much can really be wrong with your body if you're putting it to good use and performing well. And try focusing on being anxious about something with a heavy barbell on your back. Good luck with that. It's very difficult.
And I think that's really interesting as well, isn't it? I mean, the other thing that's really interesting to note about anxiety, and there's very good studies and compelling evidence in this, that anxiety and health anxiety in particular are beasts of people with above average intelligence.
Okay.
So it's almost like they have this spare capacity within their cerebral bandwidth to be able to push it towards something not useful. So if you consume that bandwidth with something else, that reduces that bandwidth to be able to even think about anxiety. So if you become consumed with doing exercise and thinking about your next exercise regime and all of this, you're not thinking about health anxiety, you're thinking about that, and it's consuming that bandwidth and it's taking it away from you. I'm not suggesting people become obsessed about exercise or obsessed about anything else, but it's all about bandwidth. And if you haven't got the ability to have that bandwidth, then you won't see it, you won't feel it. The other interesting thing about anxiety and panic disorder, which is an acute episode of severe anxiety, normally is associated with hyperventilation, an overwhelming feeling of you can't breathe, an overwhelming feeling of your heart is coming through your chest.
You feel like you're going to die, don't you?
You feel like you're going to die. That is a very similar physical representation of a high intensity, high threshold workout.
Okay.
So if you've done HIIT and you do that on a regular basis, the same trigger won't cause the same reaction. Because if you start to get to a feeling of, well, I can't breathe, you know what that actually feels like when you've done a HIIT session. And you never get to that level in a panic attack. A panic attack is not that same intensity. The intensity of exercise is far higher than a panic attack. But there's normally a trigger. So people will talk about, well, what happened was I ran to the lift. I got to the lift. I was a bit puffed. I got in the lift, the doors closed, and then I felt like the world was coming in around me and I couldn't catch my breath. Mm-hmm. Well, if you've got a base level fit respiratory system that's dealt with exercise and has dealt with that assault by doing 25-meter sprints or whatever before, when you get to the lift, you don't even recognize that you're a little bit out of breath, because it's not something it's something you associate with a good feeling and not a bad feeling. And therefore the doors close, and what actually you're thinking about is, I feel a little bit out of breath. Oh, I'm looking forward to that HIIT session tonight after work. because it's association.
Yeah, so it's like a subconscious reframing of it that's going on
Correct. Yeah.
in the background. It reminds me a bit of how, I suppose, high-level athletes would reframe pain, sometimes
Yes.
to their detriment.
Yeah.
But, the pain, and I think military people are quite prone to this, you would know better than me, but reframing that intensity that me, as a non-elite athlete, would perhaps think, okay, that's enough now, this hurts, I'm going to stop.
Yeah.
But the reframing of that actually equates to it doing less harm.
Yes, absolutely.
Apparently a lot of the impact of stress generally, not to go off too much onto a stress tangent, but is our framing of it and what we believe about it. And I think that's really interesting. And it's probably going on. So yeah, you're almost doing a practice run of what I feel like when I push myself to the brink of collapsing. That rowing thing you got me to try many months ago. I could have, that was close to death.
So this weekend, so as you know from previous episodes, I've been using Mounjaro to see what happens. And Mounjaro is one of the weight loss drugs, and I've been getting on fine with it, no real side effects, and losing weight. But one of the conversations that I've had, or some of the conversations I've had with patients is, can you exercise on it? And I've heard people going hypoglycemic on it. And this brings me around to your comment about pain. So I've done no running at all this year. In fact, my last run was 5K, and it was in December of 2024. I have done some functional fitness. I have been skiing, I think 3 weeks, but I've done no endurance work, and I've done no I've done no cycling or leg work or anything like that. And then this weekend just gone, as you know, is the London Marathon, but also the Manchester Marathon. And I had a slot for Manchester with my son, Lewis, who I've spoke about on the podcast before, who I absolutely hate because he's so fit. And Lewis said to me, "Oh, Dad, you've got that number for Manchester. Are you going to use it, or can I give it to a mate and he'll run it in your name or something?" And I said, I don't know. I said, I don't know. Could I blag it? And he went, "Oh, Dad, of course you could blag it. Just do it. You'll be fine." So I said, right, okay, I'll keep the number. And then I went to Manchester. I was going to go to Manchester anyway to watch him run. And I hadn't made my mind up until Sunday morning. And on Sunday morning, I got up and I thought, yeah, I'm going to do it. So I ran the Manchester Marathon. Now, going back to your previous about reframing pain. So what did I know? I knew it was going to be slow. I knew I wasn't going to be fast. And I knew it was going to hurt. But then I also knew, although that little demon came along and went, but will you die? But I also knew that I was unlikely to die. And so I decided I'd blag a marathon. I'm a great believer that anybody can go out and run 10 miles. It's a mind game. Big muscle in your body is the brain. So could I do it with a marathon? And could I do it on Mounjaro? And by being on Mounjaro, what does that mean? Well, it means that by Sunday, I hadn't really eaten anything since Thursday because I just don't have the appetite. I just don't feel like eating. I forced a bowl of porridge, honey and banana down me.
On the day?
I didn't want it, but I forced it down me. And I arranged with a friend to meet me at mile 18 with Red Bull, full fat Coke, and fizzy Haribos, and I did the marathon.
So for someone who's never done a marathon and never will, I've no interest in it, how would you normally fuel for a marathon?
So you would preload lots of carbs before. They talk about carb loading. They talk about
the day before?
72 hours before, ensuring that your glycogen is replaced. Night before, heavy pasta, sort of like lots of glycogen fueling. Ensure that you're saturated, that you've got enough energy, and then fueling every sort of 30 minutes with sort of something broken down glucose, so down into, it's not just sucrose, not just sugar, but broken down the further steps so it's quicker to absorb, and caffeine, and then obviously an adequate amount of fluids. It was incredibly hot on Sunday as well. So
even in Manchester.
Even in Manchester. I mean, even the guys who were like announcing Manchester, and I have to say the atmosphere in Manchester, sorry London, but the atmosphere in Manchester was better. The run was better, the support was better, and the general everything, was great. It was absolutely great. But I knew it was going to hurt, and I knew that mile 18 would be, we talk about the wall in marathon running, and I knew that mile 18 would be a dark place. I was surprised actually how light it was and not that dark. And I think that's because actually my body has got used to dealing without this carbohydrate seesaw. And I think that's what you get with Mounjaro, is you lose that seesaw. And it was my slowest marathon ever. My time on my chip time, when I say my chip time, so that's the time that's measured by the marathon people of when my foot crosses the line. You always run further in a marathon than you do than the actual course, because you do this, running round people and everything. And my chip time was 6:30. My actual on my Garmin for a marathon was 6:15. And I was very happy with that. I was very happy that I'd achieved those times. Sorry, that's my phone beeping. But it did hurt, but it's about reframing that. And it's about accepting, okay, well, what did you expect? It's going to hurt. You're not going to feel great at the time. And that's okay. And that's half the battle with anxiety. As soon as you accept, okay, well, what's the worst case scenario? Am I willing to accept the worst case scenario? So also speaking as going to sound people have been like, I'm not doing fitness. He sounds like a right mess. Speaking as a previous cancer patient, the worst case scenario, as soon as you accept everything that's in that, you're onto a winner. And I can also say that from a cancer patient perspective, exercise was entirely why I did so well. I know I'm in full remission, and I've got no reason to think that I won't stay in full remission. And when I had major surgery, I was in theatre for 8 hours, and to my surgeon's absolute disbelief, 4 months later, I swam 2 miles in the swim serpentine with no concerns. But it's because I had that base fitness before I went into theatre, and I had that mindset of exercise, that actually that's why I did so well. So exercise won't always stop you getting ill, but even if you do get ill, it will definitely prepare you for the treatment and what comes after. From a health anxiety perspective, it completely squashes that and quells those intrusive thoughts, because it, like you say, it gives you that, well, how bad can it be if I can do this?
Yeah.
And it stops. And once you challenge that demon, then once it's a two-way conversation. Once you say to that demon in your head, well, how can I do this then? The demon suddenly goes, oh, and disappears, because there's no answer to it.
Yeah. And it makes me think of the reassurance paradox. One of the worst things with any form of problematic levels of anxiety is you get into this reassurance trap, and it's never ending, because the reassurance makes you feel okay for a few minutes, but it just kind of rises to the surface again. And actually a better strategy is to challenge it head on.
Yeah.
And this is, again, part of the difficulty that we have, I suppose, as clinicians, is lack of continuity. A growing fear among clinicians of missing things means we reach for more tests, and the tests, they might offer reassurance for a while. I had a patient years ago, I'm going up probably about 15, 16 years ago, and his health anxiety focused on MS, which is a really difficult thing to say you haven't got in the early stages. And I remember him desperately asking me for an MRI scan, and he'd had one a few years before. And I was really reluctant to, because nothing had changed in the history to suggest any major change, just his anxiety of it had grown back, so to speak. And he was adamant that, no, but if I just get this one more scan, then I can move on, and I can move on. And of course it didn't. I relented and got the scan reluctantly. And months later, it just shifted. Because our bodies are awash with symptoms all the time. We sometimes are tuned into them. Often we're not, because we can't pay attention to everything, and our brain's very clever at dialing stuff up and dialing it down. depending on what's relevant. But,
Yeah.
so the test and the reassurance can come back and bite you in the arse. Yeah.
So just to unpick that a little bit. So reassurance is where I say to you, okay, no, you're okay. And you're okay because I've done this and this test and you're okay. And I'm a doctor and I'm telling you you're okay. And that reassurance works, as you quite rightly say, it can work from between minutes to hours to days to months, but it won't last forever. Whereas a challenge is where you say to that person who thinks they've got MS, okay, right, well, let's do some exercise then. Okay, right. And what can you do? Well, I can run 10 miles. Okay, right. And what else can you do? I can deadlift 150 kilos. Okay, right. And what else can you do? Well, I can do 100 press-ups. Okay. And you're worried about MS? Yeah. But you can do all that. So functionally, your life is okay. So even if you have got MS, what's the problem? And because it's not the MS that his anxiety is about. It's not MS that's the anxiety. It's the consequences of MS. Mm. So if you take away and then you go, right, okay, well, functionally, you can do all of that. So even if you have got MS, as long as you keep doing that, you see, the challenge is you're actually saying the worst possible thing it could be is irrelevant because I'm still able to do this. And that's the beauty of exercise.
Yeah, but as with all anxiety, it's all in the future, isn't it? It's all projected forward as to what if. And actually, again, a better strategy is to come back to now. Okay, and we do this with people. I mean, that scenario of pointing out to people what they can do, I do that with chest pain, particularly in those people who, my experience says to me, it's probably not cardiac for fairly valid reasons, but they're getting a little bit hung up on it because maybe somebody that they work with had a heart attack. That's understandable. And it's quite valid to be able to say, well, hang on, if you played five-a-side football on Sunday morning and you were fine, and you can use all these examples of the heart, which is a major muscle in the body, can cope with that without struggling. Probably your cardiac circulation is doing okay. It's a bit harder with some neurological things, but if somebody's really caught in the health anxiety cycle, is all projected into the future, and it can become really challenging.
But I think going back to about what the drugs do, I think if you get to somebody who's got that health anxiety and you get them into that prescription of exercise, so you're prescribing exercise as a solution, by the time they can get to a 150 deadlift, a 10-mile run, 100 press-ups, actually, the challenge isn't that anymore because it's gone. Because actually they've treated the anxiety with the natural chemicals that occur as a result of exercise.
Yeah. And hopefully they'll be too knackered, be too exhausted at the end of the day. I think fundamentally for people that we can't steer towards fitness, really, they probably need some professional psychological input to really kind of get to the bottom, unless you want to spend the rest of your life caught in a doom spiral of Googling one symptom or another. Because the reality is, as I've said to some people, you will get more symptoms as you get older, as sure as night follows day. And one day it will be real. And that is really, your worst case scenario comes. But my experience of people is in this situation, they cope fine when it happens.
Absolutely.
Well, never as bad as imagined.
So I've got what I consider health anxiety. The cancer I had, it came without any anxiety. There was no anxiety. As in, I didn't worry about it beforehand. It wasn't something that I was fixated on. It was something that I'd even really thought about. I hadn't really passed the time of day of it. And when it arrived, I dealt with it absolutely as, well, this is cancer. I need to deal with this. And I literally dealt with it like we've said. I went for a run and I continued doing that exercise if I wanted to think about it, because it took out that anxiety. When you're running, the anxiety is taken away by the bandwidth being used on that, and you free up your ability to think about it logically. And I knew that I'd be okay.
So what you're saying is, for all the things that circulated in your arena of health anxiety, the one thing that did come up wasn't in that parade.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when it did come up, the health anxiety is not about health. anxiety. It's just a manifestation of anxiety. It just happens to be that it's fixated about that. So somebody who has OCD about light switches or doors being locked, that's a subtype of anxiety. And there are lots of psychiatrists who say actually there is no such thing as health anxiety. It's all generalized, free-floating anxiety. It just happens to have paused on this bit of what you're thinking about, and it'll be replaced by something else.
Yeah,
and that's why exercise works so well, because it works generically across all anxiety disorders and depressive disorders.
Yeah, and thinking about the work that I've done on the chimp paradox model, understanding a lot of what's going on in the neuroscience, which is what that book puts in a model that is very easy to understand. And neuroscience is complicated, but it's almost, a bad habit. It's become a habit loop of fixating this habit loop anxiety cycle on this one thing. And actually it's getting to, well, what is behind that? So why is the threat? Because anxiety is just a message. It's just, that's it. It's trying to send you a message, a survival message that one of its basic drives is being triggered here, and it's taking it a few steps back from that. But
it can be an inappropriate trigger. It can be an inappropriate. It's not an appropriate. Although anxiety is part of our lives, and as we said, worry and concern about being chased by the big lion or the tiger is entirely appropriate. But when we haven't got that, and this is another theory of why anxiety exists, is because we don't have the lion and we don't have the tiger. So it's looking for something. It's there. It's looking for the lion and the tiger. It can't find the lion and the tiger, so it has to make up something to make itself utilised. And it's our interpretation of that information. But as I said before, anxiety has a very similar physiological description as exercise, but it's the interpretation of the association. So anxiety has a fast heart rate, so does exercise. Respiratory rate goes up, same. So that similarity, and it's about that interpretation, and it's about how we interpret that loop about what's happening, and also about secreting those hormones that suppress that surge of adrenaline.
Yeah. I mean, it's endemic, really, the levels of anxiety that we're seeing. I think in my 18 years of general practice, I've seen the trajectory go up and settle on younger people. And I've heard various theories. I do enjoy people who make these kind of social commentary, long podcasts about what may or may not be feeding it. And I'm not going to go on a rant about that. But I think ultimately we're a consumerist society and fear sells. If you can get somebody emotional and frightened of something, you sell a lot of insurance for a start. But if you look at things that we look at in the health space, get somebody nervous about something and sell them the solution. So that's got a big part to play in it. And actually, if we just probably had a bit less media, less news for a start. Crikey, I'll never forget chatting to a patient who was really anxious. I had to sign him off for a period of time, and it was all about when the war in Ukraine broke out. So I just assumed he was connected to Ukraine, and he wasn't. He had no connections to Russia or Ukraine at all, but the drama that was coming through the news. And another observation I've made over the years as well is, the way people come into surgery and they tend to put their phone and their keys on the desk in between you. And the most anxious people, their phones are lighting up all the time. So my top tip for everybody is
get rid of it.
Turn your damn notifications off, or just actually use your phone on your terms. Don't have news alerts. You don't need BBC News to remind you that a politician's just said something. Actually, how you feed this and what you allow in has an awful lot to do with it. You can make some choices to dial some of that stuff down, and you know what? It works.
So I think the take-home message that I would like to say is anxiety is part of lives to lesser or greater degrees, as we talked about. But if you have anxiety, don't be ashamed of it. It is something that you can talk about, and it is something that we can do about, and you shouldn't have to suffer. It's not a reflection of you as a person. The other thing is, I think people think that anxiety is a sign of weakness, and I can tell you that in my career and the jobs that I do incredibly high pressure jobs, really very intense work, and have. You would wonder if I was even alive sometimes. I'm that calm in situations of emergency. Has my pulse even gone up in those situations? But so it's not a reflection of anything else other than that part of your life. But it can be managed and it can be dealt with. And I absolutely promise you that exercise will definitely improve things. If not get rid of it completely, it will definitely improve things.
Yeah. And I also think my tip would be, if you are going to the doctor with something and it's somebody you haven't met before and you recognise that you're prone to a bit of health anxiety, then being upfront with that and being quite specific about what it is you're concerned about and why really helps.
Yeah.
Don't be tempted to do that dance of not saying and then going away dissatisfied. Jesus, if you've got through the wall to be able to get an appointment, then just say, look, I know I'm a bit prone to health anxiety. This is what's bothering me and this is why. And yes, you may get some reassurance, you may get some tests, but being upfront about it, I think, is just get what you can out of that appointment and make it count.
And ultimately, and if you're really struggling, get a PT who's a doctor.
Yes.
Do you know any?
Yes. Absolutely.
Right.
Great. So we're going to cover cancer in the next episode, aren't we? So we will meet in a couple of weeks to record that. So we welcome any feedback. If anybody's got any questions or comments, we will pick them up and respond in the next episode. So feel free to share your thoughts.
And if anybody wants to comment on how great the sound is this time, we appreciate that.
Yes. Yeah. And and any marathon tips, you won't get them. You won't get them from me. That's for sure. Great. See you next time.
Yeah.